Welcome back. How many are smiling here because session is over? Raise your hands. Okay. Mary Ellen, elections matter, don't they? You wrote a story post-session, which was headlined, and I quote, Republican remake, big GOP win, Scott scores. Now, you didn't write that headline, but did it adequately sum up your story and the session?
Yes, I think it did. I think this was one of the most ambitious agendas we've seen from a legislature in decades. They came in to, all they had to do was pass a budget. They had to pass a very tough budget with $3.8 billion budget hole. They accomplished that, but they also were able to get into just about every area of government with an attempt to change things in a big way. I mean, they went straight into Medicaid reform. They did they repealed the biggest swath of growth management law we have. They moved forward with changes in education reform. They expanded on some of the insurance, making it easier for insurance companies to do business in Florida. I mean, it was across the board. Vast amounts of change. They attempted a lot of things as well. They tried to deregulate dozens of dozens of areas of professions. They tried to get immigration reform. They tried to, make it difficult for unions to operate and be a political force in Florida. So they had a big, ambitious agenda. I think they accomplished it, and I do think that the governor was able to claim credit for a lot of it.
Brent, you and I have been around the legislative process in Florida for many years. And as Mary Ellen was speaking, I was thinking, I can't recall another session where so many big bills regarding changing public policy in Florida went through the process, and many of them were adopted. Can you?
No, I agree with you on that because of the number of issues that were, as Mary Ellen pointed out, were discussed. When you go back, the first session I was in Florida, '87, you had the big services tax that passed and was later repealed. It was such a big story, an ongoing story, went on for months and months and months. But that was a single subject. I think Childs came into office with some budget issues. Jeb Bush had an ambitious agenda his first go-around, but when the economy was far different. I mean, one of the things I'm not sure that Mary Ellen mentioned was they went into this session facing a heck of a budget deficit as well. So they accomplished a lot in the face of having to make some significant cuts. And the interesting thing to me is we kind of stepped on their own storyline at the end, though, I thought, by the way things finished. Instead of all of these things being the big news and being out there, a little squabble about some of the inner workings and, inside how things got done the last minute kind of flamed up, and it ended with a fairly nasty conclusion to what otherwise I think would have to be regarded by the people involved as quite successful.
Some of the rest of you, did the amount of legislation alone and the significance of it, did it surprise any of you?
Yeah, it was surprising, but it was they laid out a very ambitious agenda beforehand, and they, to a large degree, got it to the finish line. There were some exceptions. Immigration didn't pass. The bill to punish labor unions, deducting dues for political activity, didn't pass. But this was, considering the fact that it's a 9-week session, and they were helped immeasurably by having these huge supermajority numbers. There are more Republicans now in both chambers than there has been in a very long time.
I think that's the reason, one of the big reasons it was so ambitious. They were coming off of a 2010 election that looked like a mandate for Republicans, a sweep of Republican winners in elections, especially at the state level, but I mean a national sweep, part of it in reaction to the Obama health care law. But regardless, Republicans won big in 2010, and so it seemed like a mandate, and they had a supermajority, as Steve said. Huge number of Republicans in the House. I think that sort of emboldened them to take on some issues that they otherwise may not have in a year when they're facing such a large budget deficit. Some social issues that are really divisive and not everybody agrees on. This was one of the best sessions in my memory for the people who want to make it harder to have an abortion. It's a social issue that in other years they've kind of stayed away from a little bit, or they've been less ambitious. emphasis on. They went after that this year, I think in part because they had that supermajority.
David mentioned
go ahead.
Obama, Steve, and I was going to say is I think he was in the back of their mind. 2012 was in the back of their mind. Going forward was in the back of their mind that Republican supermajority. The Republicans from day one of the new administration in Washington have been after it, and I think that was in the back of their mind of many lawmakers this session.
Steve, I was going to ask you, this is a good segue, 2012 elections. That had to be on many levels, including individual potential candidates, but the 2012 elections had a huge impact in many areas on the 2011 legislative session. Steve, talk about some of these layers of impact from of the 2012 session.
We've just come out of an election 4 or 5 months ago, but it feels like the 2012 election is right around the corner. It's a very long election cycle this time for a couple of reasons. It's a reapportionment cycle. All the districts are being redrawn. It's a long, drawn-out process, very brutal, highly politically charged. I mean, it's difficult to imagine the Republicans having a stronger presence in the legislature than they have now, but that's what they're going to want to accomplish. Number two, Mike Herodopoulos, the president of the state Senate, is running for the United States Senate, and he's in a very contentious primary already with at least 2 other guys. And Herodopoulos, as the Senate president, can basically command the bully pulpit for the whole time the legislature's in session. So there's that. The fact that we've got 2 more electoral votes, we've got 29 electoral votes now because of population shifts. Florida's a bigger player than ever. We're now the 3rd largest state, and everyone knows President Obama has to win Florida to win re-election. So, I mean, you add all those things up, it's an immense political equation right there.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. Let's talk about Senate President Herodopoulos and what this session meant to him. He does have a bully pulpit, but there are also some liabilities that come with that bully pulpit. There are votes that can be taken, there are leadership opportunities, and there are also opportunities for his potential competitors to say, well, you missed that one, you didn't get this one. So talk about that. Anyone want to take up, what kind of session did he have?
Pretty well till near the end. It all melted down at the end, and Mary Ellen should chime in on this. It melted down at the end because he couldn't control his people the way Dean Cannon can control that very young House of Representatives class. And it's because it really isn't all Herodopoulos' fault. It's the nature of the Senate as an institution. They don't like being told what to do, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think part of it is that, you know, Herodopoulos is running in a primary, and a primary means he has to really cater to the right and the true voters that show up in a primary, which have proven themselves to be Tea Partiers and really the right of the right. So he needed to have an agenda that reflected that. So he tried to push things through. He pushed the Senate into taking a vote on immigration. It was something that failed badly. He tried very hard to try and get this paycheck, dues deduction ban from paychecks for all state workers or all public employees, and they failed with that. And part of the reason is that, as Steve said, the Senate, by its nature, is a moderating factor. When the Democrats were in control, the House would always move, the agenda to the left, and the Senate would move it to the middle. Now, when the Republicans are in control, the House moves the agenda to the right, and the Senate moves it to the middle. And that's what happened this session. And it's, I think it was a big awakening for the history professor Mike Herodopoulos to see that this is how the chamber, when under pressure, it's going to act.
And that's kind of how the process is set up in the Constitution.
That's right.
David, Steve mentioned reapportionment, redistricting. And you could almost speculate about what that's going to be like. Brent and I have been around long enough. We've been through a couple of these. But what is it going to be like, and how will the relationship between the members likely change, and what kind of substantive legislation is likely to get through next year?
The redistricting process is all about self-interest largely, and politics, and not just self-interest of the individual members, although a lot of people would say that is the dominant factor. But who has power, who gets represented, and by how much?
Who doesn't?
Well, and who doesn't? And, in addition to the self-interest of the obvious kind where, a member wants to protect a district that he can win. There's also the self-interest of particular groups, African Americans, rural voters, Hispanics are going to be a big one, and trying to draw a map where that reflects the actual the way the state looks in terms of its political power is difficult and ripe for all kinds of political shenanigans, and that's going to that I think will dominate everything else. When you're so worried about protecting your own district, it's hard to sort of get involved in arcane pension legislation. And I also, Tom Feeney, when he was the speaker, was asked why that process had to be so political. And he said, just because it is politics, and you can't take the politics out of politics. There is nothing more political than who is in the legislature, who gets to represent people. And it's impossible to, now this year, boy, this year is going to be really interesting because we had a couple of constitutional amendments passed that basically said you're supposed to draw those districts without taking into account politics, without taking into account your party, your own personal interest. And almost universally, the legislature said, well, we don't see how we can do that. I think maybe for self-interested reasons, but also I think legitimately. How do you draw those districts without trying to protect incumbents? Well, we're going to find out this year because that's what they're supposed to do under the Constitution.
Some tinkering, I thought, started already with tinkering of the elections laws going forward in this session. That I think.
Talk about that tinkering.
Well, I think just to kind of summarize it, I think the view of the party out of power would say that they're trying to weaken our ability to be successful in the 2012 elections. They see the shortening up of the time frame, I think, on early voting and some of the other issues that were before the legislature as an impediment to, certainly I would think, to the president's reelection. So I think some of that before even the redistricting.
Occasional voters.
And, I think that's an interesting point because, it's very clear to me that, as you've said, the 2012 election really overshadowed a lot of what they did, and so did reapportionment. I think that because of these two amendments that were approved by voters, I think there is a feeling among the Republicans in control that the districts ultimately are going to be drawn by the courts, and if they are, they're going to see some dilution of their strength. And with that, they want to make sure that they still can keep as much control as they can, and so that's why they've passed this election law, I suspect, that will make it more difficult for some of the groups, like college kids can't change their address on election day anymore. We've got limited or concentration of early voting hours, less ability for supervisors of elections to stretch it out over several weeks, and so those are exactly the groups that voted heavily in the 2008 presidential election.
All right.
Republicans, though.
Yeah, right.
Let's go to break and come back and we'll talk about some other interesting things that occurred during the 2011 session.